Hi, photo students. This is a video introduction to your first long assignment. This is going to be specifically dealing with part one of a three-part assignment. And I want to stress that I'm currently in the interface, by the way, for Google Classroom. This will look a little different on your end, but I want to walk through what you're looking at so you get your bearings in terms of how these longer assignments will be deployed to you. Now, I want to stress that this first part of this assignment is going to be exclusively shooting photographs. Okay, so I'm not expecting you to post anything. I'm not expecting you to create a WordPress of the images you're going to be doing and photographing in this part one of this assignment. This is just a deadline only. So I really want you to focus on the techniques that we're going to be learning in terms of how to get our bearings and understand our cameras, the manual settings of those cameras and its functions, and then how we're going to utilize that to do what's called bracketing. And bracketing is going to be focused on how to get proper exposure, so getting images that are properly exposed for editing. Because next in part two and part three, we're going to be practicing our workflow. So how we go from taking images with our camera and then bringing them into a digital darkroom, such as Photoshop, some kind of editing software, but bringing them into the computer, and then how we're going to output that. And we've been already practicing how we're outputting to WordPress, but we're going to also discuss how you're going to consider and think about output to print. So this is the interface here through Google Classroom where it explains this. So it says part one of this assignment does not get posted to your WordPress site. You're going to be photographing 300 images for this first assignment, and this is going to make more sense. It sounds intimidating, but it's not nearly as big a deal as it sounds. But I'm a really big proponent of learning by doing, and so we're going to learn to photograph by doing photography and photographing as much as we possibly can. So what you're seeing is this assignment's in three parts. This is just part one on bracketing, and below I've attached a Google Doc that's going to outline this assignment. I'll go through in a minute. A link to what are called Camera Basics, but it's a series, a playlist of videos through YouTube. General settings for your camera, and I'm using the interface of a Nikon D3500, mainly because this is the camera that we use for checkout in the course, and it's the loaner camera, so I'm basing everything off of that basic introductory DSLR camera. And then just an image here of how I'm going to illustrate how I'd like you to hold the camera. So I'm going to start here with this long one, part one bracketing, and go into the Google Doc. And at the top of this Google Doc, when you enter it, you're going to see what's called the exposure triangle. And this is just a visualization of how we understand the camera functions as they pertain to exposure. So the way that aperture, shutter speed, and ISO that you're seeing in these three corners here, how they interrelate in order to gather proper exposure. Now, I'm not going to go into heavy detail and use a ton of time on this video to detail this exposure triangle, mainly because you'll get sick of hearing my voice from experience. And I do have some solid resources through our YouTube playlist that will do a good job of illustrating the technical facets of this exposure triangle. So I'd like you to scroll down. I want you to notice that I've designated this first part. It's actually a little out of sequence for what will be the way that long assignments are laid out for the rest of the semester, mainly because it's hard to gather everyone and get everybody on board when registration is still open through the first week of classes. And because we're in a particular situation with this semester, this unique semester we're in, there's a little bit of a pushback on my ability to get you loaner cameras. So I'm just a little off sequence. Typically our long assignments would be due on a Sunday, so they'd be deployed on a Monday and due a week later. Now this one I'm going to actually put out on a Thursday and have it due the following Thursday. So we're in week 2. This is going to be due week 3, day 2. So that's next Thursday. And you're going to have no less than 300 images for this. And I just reiterate here that this is a deadline only for shooting images. You're not downloading them to your computer at all. You're not doing any processing of these images, just photographing. Now I've given you some resources here. This is there are a couple links here to what are called camera simulators. These are really good vehicles for practicing the interface of your camera through some kind of online simulation. And so you'll be able to have a generic or, fake scene, and you can play around with some of these functions in order to understand the results based on your settings. Now, the thing that I would like you to stress is I think you should select manual when working with this, so you can really gain knowledge by putting in specific settings. For instance, you can put in the settings that will be some of the examples we're going to use that I'll detail in terms of bracketing. You can dial those in and see what those results look like. Now, this right here is going to be the button you push in order to take an image. Now, the thing that they've done here that's really convenient and nice is that they give you a moving subject, both as a portrait, a person who's swaying, but also a pinwheel that's also moving. So play around with some of these. You can play around with the lighting of the situation, the distance you're from your subject, the focal length. So this, again, 18 millimeter is a wide angle. This is when you get more telephoto, or when you're in 55 millimeter, you're a little bit closer to the angle of view that we see with our own eyes. ISO, aperture, and shutter speed we're going to talk about in depth here in a second, but I want you to also notice when you switch some of these settings, for instance, like ISO changes here, aperture, this dial right here changes, and then I really want you to pay attention to how the numbers work here. So these are all in fractions here, so this is 1/100th of a second. And this aperture is measured in what are called f-stops. And again, we'll go over that in detail. So here's a camera simulation that you can play around with. I give you a second one here too that Canon puts out that does a very similar setup. This one has a toy airplane that has a propeller moving. So again, you have the ability to change the aperture, shutter speed, ISO. It's already, I believe, in manual mode. Yeah, it is. And then you're able to dial in a little less specific than the, where you're able to change the vocal or the distance and focal length, but you are able to take a few shots in a row and compare and contrast them, which I think is also nice. So that's a couple resources there that you can use. Here's the Camera Basics playlist. This is going to give you a series of videos that detail things technically. that I'd like you to know about your camera. Now, if you want to go into some of these camera basics here, feel free. The ones that I'm stressing though, I think these are really wonderful illustrations of how aperture, shutter speed, and ISO all work in tandem in order to help you gain proper exposure with your images. So I want you to watch these three at least. Now, you scroll down, I've given you a couple options for going over exposure triangle. The one that I really like that's a little more in-depth is produced through this online realtor called Adorama. This one I would highly recommend watching. If you want to know a little bit more about how your DSLR camera works, this is a really great video as well. And then we'll go through some of these more throughout the semester, and this playlist will probably grow as well. Now if I come back here, I also gave it's a little bit dated, but still I think really effective. I wanted to also offer a reading option on your camera controls. So if you wanted to, there's a PDF here that you can open up that will give you text-based ways of learning. Now, in terms of the assignment and moving on from there, I want to hold off real quick until I get into that, but I want to make sure that one thing is stressed in terms of some technique. And one of them I like to make certain of, because I think it's more critical than we often give it credit, but I really want you to pay attention to how you hold your camera. This is a really good illustration. I personally, everyone's a little bit unique in terms of how they feel comfortable holding a camera, but there's a lot of conditioning in terms of maybe how we've seen other people photograph or how we think intuitively we should hold a camera. But the primary thing here to notice is that the hand needs to come under your lens and hold underneath with your palm. The typical way most people gravitate toward it is to hold their index finger above and kind of pinch the lens, whereas this is specifically a technique of holding the camera that stabilizes your camera. Now, the key here is to consider or think of your arm as a tripod, right? As a device that is going to keep your camera as stable as possible. Now, when you're learning about ISO and you're learning about shutter speed, this is pretty critical because holding your camera still as possible is only gonna be to your advantage. Okay, so in terms of more classic or basic photography, this is really fairly key. So if you catch yourself doing it the other way, it's not the end of the world, but I'll guarantee you that you'll have a little bit less stability, which inevitably will lend itself to blurrier images or there being some shake in your images, less sharp. The other thing that can happen and will happen most likely is that when you're pinching it the other way, the tendency is to have your pinky drifting downward, and believe it or not, you're going to, even if you're conscious of it, every once in a while your pinky is going to sneak into the direction or the lens, right? It's going to sneak in front of the lens and become part of your image, and it's undoubtedly going to be the image you want. So just keep that in mind. I wanted to stress this because I think it's one of the more critical things to train yourself to do, because it doesn't feel often as intuitive to hold a camera in this capacity. Now, the only other thing to consider, not to make this too long-winded, but you'll notice that this person is photographing with their right eye, and they're also keeping their other eye closed. This is kind of a generic thing that they're demonstrating here. All of us, if you don't know this already, have a dominant eye, most likely. And I'm not sure I've ever heard of someone who is ambidextrous or is able to have two dominant eyes. But my dominant eye is abnormal, and I don't use my right eye. I use my, when I use my viewfinder, I use my left eye, and I also keep my right eye completely open. So there's no steadfast way of doing it. There's no right or wrong necessarily, except for what works for you. So do what's effective. So look through the viewfinder, figure out what feels natural. Don't force anything. The only thing I think you should consider is making certain that you hold your camera underneath with your lens in this direction to mimic a tripod.